Good afternoon. My name is Tim Fleiszer, and I'm the Executive Director of Concussion Legacy Foundation Canada. We are here today to talk about an issue that has been overlooked and misunderstood for far too long. The relationship between military service, brain injuries, and the profound mental health challenges, including PTSD, that many of our Canadian veterans face. The women and men who serve our country dedicate their lives to protecting others. They face dangers that most of us can only imagine, whether in combat zones like Afghanistan, during high-stakes missions, or in intensive training environments that push them to their limits. These experiences, however, often come at a cost. Repeated exposures to blasts, combat training, firing artillery, parajumping, falls, accidents, collisions, and any activity exposing them to head impacts leaves many veterans with invisible brain injuries. We can no longer separate mental health from brain health. A veteran with a brain injury is more likely to experience PTSD, depression, and other mental health challenges. If we dismiss the impact of these injuries, we increase the risk of suicide, a tragedy that has already claimed too many lives. At Concussion Legacy Foundation Canada, we believe in a different path forward. We are committed to supporting military personnel and veterans through research, education, patient navigation, and advocacy. We are committed to helping veterans access the care and benefits they need. The global research on this topic has evolved significantly in the last 12 months. Decision makers must now recognize the connection between blast injuries, brain trauma, and mental health. We need to listen to our veterans, support the changes they need, and advocate for a system that reflects compassion and understanding. These brave individuals have earned our respect, and they deserve immediate action to address the effect of brain injuries on their well-being. It is my pleasure to introduce retired Master Corporal Shane Nedohin to share his personal experience. Shane?
Thanks, Tim. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here. My name is Shane Nedohin. I'm a veteran, a husband, and a father. After nearly 22 years in the Canadian Armed Forces, multiple combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as many domestic and international deployments elsewhere around the globe, I thought the hardest battles were behind me. What I didn't know was that the hardest battle would lie ahead. The invisible wounds, the brain injuries caused by repeated blast exposures would follow me home and reshape my life. In the years leading up to and following my service, I started experiencing memory and concentration issues, anxiety, headaches, vertigo, tinnitus, extreme mood swings, physical changes in my body, and many other debilitating symptoms. At first, these symptoms were very insidious. I didn't necessarily make the connection between what I was experiencing and my work that I conducted as a member of the military, unaware of the broad range of symptoms that are caused by repeated blast exposure. It wasn't until very late in my career when my symptoms became more severe and I experienced the acute onset of several physical, mental, and neurocognitive issues, many of which overlap each other and mimic each other, that I put the pieces together. I was diagnosed with hypothyroidism, ADHD, anxiety disorders, hypertension, and PTSD. The cumulative weight of these diagnoses led to my medical release in January of this year. When I reached out for help, I turned to the Royal Canadian Legion's Veteran Services Network to guide me through the complex process of completing my disability paperwork for Veterans Affairs Canada. I wanted to believe that VAC would stand by me after everything I'd given, but instead they refuted and denied many of these conditions, or that they could be related to my service. My TBI claim was withdrawn by VAC on multiple occasions. Every time I would appeal or submit additional medical evidence to have it reinstated, it would be withdrawn again, stating that I did not have a positive diagnosis. Disability adjudicators at VAC then sent me a letter stating that I required more medical evidence connecting my injuries to the struggles I live with every day, and concluded that there is no medical evidence to support neurocognitive decline as a result of blast injuries. In layman's terms, They told me that explosions don't cause brain damage. That letter was more than just a slap in the face. It was a sucker punch. It was a sucker punch that hit me harder than any blast I had experienced in my military career. In that moment, I was broken. I felt invisible and that no one was listening. No one could help me. And while I've previously grappled with passing suicidal thoughts, in that moment, I began to seriously consider taking my own life. After giving up almost all hope, I saw a former colleague publicly share his experiences with traumatic brain injury and CTE and reached out to him. His words of encouragement, along with our shared experiences, encouraged me to keep fighting. He also did something else that changed everything. He put me in touch with Tim Fleiszer of the Concussion Legacy Foundation of Canada. Tim threw me the lifeline that I needed. Thanks, Tim. His team not only provided me with the resources that I needed, they gave me hope. Tim Fleiszer and his team recognized what the system would not. The very real connection between blast injuries and brain health challenges like TBI and chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE. Knowing that someone believed me, that someone saw me, has given me hope and has given veterans hope. But hope alone won't change things. The system needs to evolve, demanding perfect documentation, unequivocal diagnoses, and irrefutable empirical data for such ambiguous injuries and symptoms that often mimic each other, leaves the burden of proof on veterans. It turns VAC into a pseudo court of law where the onus lies on the veteran to prove beyond a reasonable doubt his injuries. A system where one's assumed to be lying unless a doctor says otherwise. Our injuries don't come with time-stamped paperwork. Brain injuries like the ones I've sustained don't always show up right away and don't always present with the same symptoms from person to person. The longer we wait to acknowledge this reality, the more veterans will suffer in silence. Thankfully, the military has started to adjust, making critical changes to reduce and mitigate the risks of blast exposure and training, a crucial step in blast injury prevention. Even with these improvements, however, we must recognize that exposure is sometimes part of the job, and when veterans come home with the consequences of that exposure, the military, the medical system, and the government must stand by them. Guilty until proven innocent is not acceptable. If you break something, you fix it. That's accountability, and that's what we need. A friend of mine, a fellow breacher, Pete Duff, didn't make it through his battle. His death was a reminder of what's at stake if we don't act. No veteran should ever feel that suicide is their only way out. To every veteran listening, you are not alone. Your story matters. And to everyone else, families, communities, policymakers, I ask that you listen, believe, and stand with us. Together we can create a system that truly honors the sacrifices made to this country. Thank you.
Now we're going to ask Major General Denis Thompson, retired, to come and speak about how some of our allies are addressing this issue.
Thank you, Tim. Good afternoon. First of all, I would state unequivocally that Shane's story, unfortunately, is not unique amongst Canadian veterans, and nor is it unique amongst our allies. In the United States, this issue has been advanced quite a bit, certainly much further forward than where we are today. And they recognize that blast overpressure, which is produced by a whole range of weapons, the same weapons used by our people, our soldiers in the Canadian Armed Forces, has been the direct cause of brain injury to a number of soldiers inside their institution. Additionally, they have identified those military occupation codes that are related, that are at risk of sustaining these brain injuries. So I think what we're really asking for is that we move ahead and embrace the work that's being done in the United States and apply it to our veterans, including men like Shane.
Do we have any questions?
Excuse me, sorry. Veterans Affairs says that they have more than 500 traumatic brain injury claims on hold because of a lack of medical evidence. And I wondered if you could maybe just sort of respond to that and elaborate, if you wouldn't mind, on when you talk about how the research has evolved so rapidly in just 12 months, what research does exist and that has become new in the last 12 months?
So I'll have Dr. Samantha Bureau come and address the research question, and after we'll ask Carolyn Hughes from the Legion to talk about the claims. Dr. Bureau?
Yeah, so thank you. So regarding the research, we're seeing more and more people study this populations, but there was a very large study that came out in 2023 with about 860,000 U.S. veterans. This one focused on mental health and showed that those who had a traumatic brain injury were significantly more likely to have new onset mental health conditions than the veterans that did not. This mimics studies we've seen come out of CHEO in 2020 in youth. We also know that through unpublished data, so this is not in the scientific literature yet, but our colleagues in the US shared with us today that 179 of the 307 veterans who've donated their brains for study were diagnosed with CTE, so that's about 60%. The vast majority, so 140, were diagnosed with late stages, so stage 3 or 4 out of 4. We have studies that aren't new, but are certainly in the medical literature, including those from Canada as early as 2015, 2021, showing that there is structural change to the brain following blast exposure in individuals like breachers who are exposed to this in areas of the brain that are responsible for cognition, for example. So like Shane was mentioning some of his symptoms, if we see damage on a scan to this area of the brain, it's certainly telling that there's a severe injury there, because many mild traumatic brain injuries will not even show up on some of these scans that we're looking at. But again, a lot of the changes that are happening in the field also are around how we discuss these injuries. So nomenclature, terminology, which is causing a lot of confusion, and there's not a lot of consensus on these names for these things that we're saying. So then we have all this literature that's out there under concussion, MTBI, traumatic brain injury, blast exposure, blast injury, when in reality, most people are talking about very similar things. And I will leave it with a stat again out of the US because they're doing a good job of tracking this, but up to 23% of the traumatic brain injuries that were reported from 2000 to 2018 were directly caused by blast. So we know that blast is a substantial factor for traumatic brain injury, and traumatic brain injury is very well characterized in its symptoms.
Yes, regarding Veterans Affairs claims, each situation would be different for each veteran, but what I can say is that the research that has been done by our allies needs to be adopted by Veterans Affairs much faster. It does save lives, and the fact that they're withdrawing and not contacting the veteran first to explain why and what's happening, that he got a letter in the mail and it wasn't explained to him, is unacceptable. So when our command service officers help with disability claims, we can fight right to the highest level of appeal. So I would encourage anybody who has been denied before, don't give up. Come and talk to us. We're happy to help. We work very closely with the Concussion Legacy Foundation, and we're very happy to support them with all they do. So thank you.
If you have a question on Zoom, please use the raise hand function. As usual, one question, one follow-up. Si vous êtes sur Zoom et avez une question, s'il vous plaît, utilisez la fonction main levée. Comme à l'habitude, une question et une question de suivi.
And also I'll state I was remiss, Dr. Samantha Bureau, who's our international research liaison between our US group, our Canadian group, our group in the United Kingdom, and our group in Australia. And this is Carolyn Hughes from the Royal Canadian Legion.
I know that the Concussion Legacy Foundation sort of has its roots in sport, right? I wonder if you could characterize the distinction between how fast professional sport has moved to address this issue, all the way from youth sport to the professional, versus how you've seen militaries move to address it and veterans bureaucracies.
Great. Absolutely. Great question. That's my background, former professional football player. Because I was Chris Nowinski's teammate at Harvard, I've had a front row seat to what's been happening in the U.S. right from the very early days. And it took quite a while in sports for this information to get adopted. This Chris wrote his book, or started writing his book in 2006. And the early days, Concussion Legacy Foundation on the U.S. side was founded in 2007. So we're looking at quite a while. I mean, we're still not there in sports. NFL quarterbacks with millions of people watching on TV with 60,000 people sitting in the stands and a spotter watching still make mistakes on this, right? With quarterbacks, the prime position in sports. So it has taken quite a while. I am pleased to say that our experience with the Canadian military has been quite different. We started talking about this with them in 2018, and we've already seen them making changes, particularly at JTF2 in terms of training protocols. So my experience in dealing with the sporting leagues and my experience dealing with the Canadian military has been night and day in a very positive way for the Canadian military.
Mr. Thompson, could you talk about that? I mean,
Sure.
like how you saw that, how you've seen the issue evolve, like in your military career?
Right, so I think exactly as Tim has put it, it has changed today largely because the issue was raised to the military chain of command starting in 2018 and we have put continuous pressure. The issue now is not so much the serving members but more so the veterans because they served, as I did, during a period when if you had a head injury it was just suck it up, buttercup, and you had to carry on. There was no, once you cleared the fog in your head, you just got right back in. So that's a big change. And the principal difference is we understand that in combat, soldiers are going to experience concussion. That's unavoidable. And it happens whether it's an IED or whether it's just using a weapon that produces blast overpressure. And certainly in Shane's case, since he was a special operations operator, then he would have been exposed even more often to these blast overpressures. What's important is that those that didn't benefit from a change in the training regime, we need to look after them. We owe them that much as a minimum for the service that they gave us while we were still operating basically in the darkness about concussions.
Thank you. This concludes the press conference. Merci.
Thank you.